Tonight, we have 3 disturbing Skinwalker horror stories. First, a grieving grandfather follows the sound of his dead granddaughters giggling into the dark, only to find a monster that uses her voice as a lure. Next, a young hiker steps just 40 feet off the trail, but the dust that blows into his eyes turns his blood to sludge and slowly erases his mind. Finally, a woman trusts her regular delivery driver until he moves with a liquid grace that no human should have and leads her away without saying a word. You need to watch until the very last minute of that final story. There is a detail about what the creature does in their backyard, standing on 2 legs, that will make you lock your windows tonight. Gage vanished just 20 minutes into the Utah desert while following the voice of his dead granddaughter. That is the only fact the police know for sure. When rangers found his phone 30 minutes later, it was sitting at the exact GPS coordinates of his last transmission, but Gage was gone. The only evidence left behind is a recording. The last 4 minutes of his 911 call are nothing but a deep scratching noise that copies the deceased child's final words with haunting digital perfection. To understand how a rational man walks to his own death, you have to understand the Uintah Basin. The wind out here doesn't just blow, it moans through the sagebrush like a thing in pain. For Gage, that sound was the only company he had left on his farm. Within a single month, his world had been hollowed out. A sickness the doctors called COVID had swept through the valley, claiming both his youngest daughter and his 7-year-old granddaughter. The farmhouse, once full of noise and life, was now silent. The air inside always felt heavy, thick with a grief that hadn't quite settled. It smelled of old dust and the stale metallic scent of a house that is slowly dying. Even the land seemed to turn against him. Despite the clear skies and perfect weather, his entire crop had rotted in the soil. The fields surrounding the house were a blackened, foul-smelling mush. When Gage walked the perimeter, the ground didn't sound like soft dirt. It crunched like dried bone under his boots. He was a broken man, and in the high desert, isolation and sorrow act like a lighthouse for things that hunt in the dark. It started on a Tuesday night. Gage sat on his porch, the wood groaning under his weight every time he shifted. The only other sound was the rhythmic ringing of a metal wind chime that hadn't moved in weeks. Tonight it swung violently. Then he saw them. Over the rotted fields, golden white orbs began to pulse. They didn't flicker like flashlights or burn like fire. They breathed. They expanded and contracted with a soft, hypnotic glow. Then came the sound that shattered his heart. From the pitch-black scrub at the edge of the property, a high-pitched melodic giggle drifted on the breeze. It was unmistakable. It was the laugh of his late granddaughter. Driven by a desperate, irrational hope, Gage stepped off the porch. His boots snapped against the dry earth as he walked away from the safety of the porch light. He followed the golden orbs for 20 minutes, deeper into the high desert brush than he had ever gone at night. The further he went, the louder the giggling became, dancing just ahead of him in the shadows. Deep in the scrub, the cold finally began to bite through his flannel shirt. Reality started to bleed back in through the grief. Shaking, Gage pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen cast a harsh, clinical blue light on his weathered face as he dialed 911. "I've been walking 20 minutes," Gage whispered into the receiver. His voice trembled so hard the words almost caught in his throat. "The lights, they're right here. My granddaughter is calling me from the scrub. She's right there." The dispatcher's voice was a calm, mechanical contrast to the rising wind. "I've got Ranger Callahan 30 minutes out, Gage. Stay on the line with me. Don't hang up." Gage moved closer to the pulsing glow, but as the distance closed, the giggling stopped. It didn't fade, it transformed. The sweet sound of a child was replaced by a dry, racking cough. It was a wet, struggling sound. It was the exact sound of the pneumonia Gage had heard in the hospital room during those final, agonizing days. "Gage? Gage, are you there?" the dispatcher asked through the phone's speaker. A sudden, sharp thud echoed through the line as the phone hit the dirt. The connection remained open, but Gage didn't pick it up. For the next 4 minutes, the 911 recorder captured a sound that defied nature. It was a deep, scratching noise, like something heavy dragging its claws over gravel. This was interrupted by a guttural, non-human rasp. The voice was distorted, like a recording played at the wrong speed, but it mimicked the dead girl's words with terrifying precision. "Grandpa," the rasping thing whispered through the static. "Why didn't you save me?" 30 minutes later, the gravel crunch of a patrol car announced Ranger Callahan's arrival at the farmhouse. He found the back door standing wide open, banging rhythmically against the frame in the wind. Inside, the house was a tomb. On the kitchen table, a single cup of coffee sat. Callahan touched the ceramic. It was still steaming, as if Gage had set it down only seconds ago. Callahan didn't wait. He followed the GPS coordinates from the 911 call, driving his truck through the blackened, rotted fields. The headlights cut through the dust, illuminating the twisted shapes of the dead crops. When he reached the location, he cut the engine. The silence of the desert was absolute until he clicked on his high-powered searchlight. The beam cut through the dark, landing on a massive, wolf-like creature hunched on all fours. But as it turned to face the light, Callahan felt his stomach drop. Its proportions were wrong. The limbs were too long, the joints bending in ways that suggested human bones forced into a beast's shape. Its eyes didn't reflect the searchlight. Instead, they held the dying, sickly glow of the golden orbs. The creature didn't growl. It didn't snarl. It looked directly into the light and spoke. The voice that came out of the monster's throat was perfect, clear, sweet, and identical to the granddaughter Gage had buried months before. It looked at the armed ranger, but spoke to a ghost. "Grandpa, please save me," it said. With a blurred, unnatural speed, the creature vanished into the darkness. At that exact moment, the golden orbs in the distance blinked out, leaving the desert in total, suffocating blackness. Gage was never seen again. Despite Callahan being on the scene within minutes of the call, there were no footprints in the soft desert sand. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, and no trace of a man having walked into the brush. The only evidence that Gage had ever been there was his phone, lying in the dirt with a shattered screen, still connected to a silent 911 operator. In the Uintah Basin, the locals do not call these things mimics. They whisper the name Skinwalker. The legends say that a skinwalker does not just hunger for flesh, it starves for suffering. It didn't just find Gage that night. It had been hunting him for months. It was the rot that withered his crops. It was the shadow behind the sickness that took his daughter and granddaughter. It stripped him of everything he loved, fattened itself on his sorrow. And when he was finally hollow enough, it took him too. Grady stepped 40 feet off the trail to use the restroom while hiking with friends. 6 months later, the 27-year-old died of total organ failure, despite medical records showing his body was biologically healthy. It was a Saturday afternoon when the end began. They were hiking deep within Arizona's Canyon de Chelly. To the locals, this land is sacred, but dangerous. Known territory for the Skinwalker. Grady and his friends didn't know the lore. They didn't know the rules. They were just tourists walking blindly into a trap. The sun baked the sandstone walls until they radiated heat like an oven. Despite the harshness, the canyon was alive with the call of birds and the dry, grinding sound of hiking boots crushing loose gravel. Grady was hiking with his two best friends, Gage and Summer. They were making good time through the shadows of the towering cliffs. "My water just turned into tea," Summer joked, shaking her canteen. "It's boiling." Gage wiped sweat from his forehead. "At least the view is worth the heat stroke." Grady grinned, stopping to catch his breath. He looked around at the gnarled juniper trees and the endless red rock. "View is great," he said, "but nature is calling." He pointed toward a dense patch of scrub oak and tamarisk about 40 feet off the main trail. "Be right back. Got to go drop a deuce." It was a crude, normal moment. He stepped off the path, pushing through the dry brush until the vegetation swallowed him up. He found a small clearing, hidden by a wall of twisted juniper. It was quiet here. The wind swirled in tight, unpredictable circles. Grady unbuckled his belt, pulled his pants down, and settled into a squat. He took a minute, breathing in the hot, dry air. He finished up and reached into his cargo pocket for a travel pack of wet wipes. The plastic crinkled softly in the quiet air. He cleaned himself up quickly, sealed the used wipe into a small Ziploc bag, and tucked it away to pack out. Just as he was zipping the bag, a sudden, erratic gust of wind whipped through the clearing. It kicked up a small, dense cloud of fine gray grit from the canyon floor. Grady blinked hard. The dust hit him right in the face, coating his eyelashes and stinging his eyes. "Damn it," he muttered, rubbing his eyes. It grit against his cornea, a sharp, irritating scratch. He blinked rapidly, trying to flush it out with tears, but the dust was incredibly fine. It felt like it dissolved instantly into the moisture of his eye. He stood up, buckled his belt, and rubbed his eyes one last time. It was a dusty day in a dusty canyon. It happened. He didn't feel a curse take hold. He didn't see a monster. He just felt like he had sand in his eye. When he stepped back onto the trail, he looked annoyed but normal. "Everything come out all right?" Gage joked. Grady stared past him, eyes watering slightly. The irritation was gone, replaced by a strange, cool numbness. "Yeah," he said, his voice flat. "Let's go." The walk back took nearly 10 hours. Gage and Summer noticed the change immediately. Grady didn't walk like himself. His easy stride was gone, replaced by a stiff wooden gait. Every time his boots hit the dirt, it didn't sound like a shoe hitting earth. It made a dull, heavy impact. It sounded more like stone striking stone than bone and flesh. "Grady, you okay?" Gage asked. Grady didn't turn his head. He didn't even blink. His eyes were dry, glassy, and fixed on a point far in the distance. Suddenly, Grady stopped. The heavy impacts of his boots ceased. He tilted his head toward the deep shadows of the canyon walls. He claimed he could hear his grandmother's voice calling his name from the dark crevices. "She's calling me," he whispered. Gage and Summer heard nothing but the wind moaning through the canyon. They had to physically pull him along the path. On the drive home, Grady just stared out the window at the dark desert, his face reflecting in the glass like a mask. 1 month later, the decay reached his daily life. Grady worked a standard office job. One morning, his boss found him sitting at his desk. Grady's hands were hovering over the keys, poised to type. But they weren't moving. He wasn't blinking. He sat there for 8 hours without moving a single muscle. The office buzzed around him, but Grady was a statue. He was fired that afternoon for non-responsiveness. He didn't argue. He just stood up and walked out with that same heavy wooden step, At 27, Grady moved back into his childhood bedroom. His grandmother became his full-time caretaker. The house became a tomb. She would bring him bowls of warm soup. "Please, Grady, eat for me," she would whisper. She would place a spoon to his lips. His jaw would open with a dry, creaking sound, like an old door hinge. But he no longer recognized her. He wouldn't swallow. The food would just sit in his mouth, cooling, until it spilled out. It was as if the thing inside him didn't recognize human food as fuel. It was feeding on the dust instead. By the 4th month, Grady was moved to the hospital. The room was filled with the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. It was a countdown. Grady was skeletal. His ribs pushed against his skin, which had turned a bruised, translucent gray. You could almost see the darkness flowing underneath. Doctors inserted a nasogastric tube to force-feed him. The plastic tube slid down his throat with a wet friction sound. Grady didn't fight. He just stared at the ceiling with wide, non-blinking eyes. His organs began to shut down. His blood had turned to a thick, dark substance the doctors called sludge. It moved slowly through his veins. Finally, the mechanical hissing of a ventilator took over his breathing. The doctors ran every test imaginable. They scanned his brain, his blood, his marrow. The results were impossible. According to the charts, Grady was a healthy 27-year-old man. No disease, no infection, nothing. There was absolutely no explanation for why he was dying. At the 5-month mark, the beeping stopped. The monitor emitted a long, flat tone. Grady was gone. The official diagnosis was failure to thrive. The nurses came in to prepare his body. The room was deathly still. The only sound was the rustle of latex gloves. As a nurse leaned in to clean his face, she froze. She gasped. There, in the deep creases of Grady's eyelids, was gray dust. Despite months of hospital baths and medical care, it had never washed off. It had persisted, clinging to his skin until the very end. That gray dust was not sand. In the dark corners of folklore, it is known as corpse powder, a poison ground from the bones of the dead, used by skinwalkers to wither their victims. The skinwalker is an intelligent being. It does not strike at random. It chooses its victims wisely. Grady made a fatal mistake that day. He isolated himself. By stepping off that trail, he left pieces of himself for the witch to take advantage of. When he used the restroom in that clearing, he left behind biological material, trace elements that, in the wrong hands, can be used for the darkest kind of magic. We don't know if it was the powder in his eyes or the waste he left in the dirt that sealed his fate. Perhaps it was both. But know this, these entities are patient. They watch from the tree line. They love it when you are alone. So the next time you step off the trail, watch out, or you're next. Paloma disappeared while taking out the trash 30 feet from her front door at 9:14 p.m. 3 days later, she was recovered from a cave 12 miles away, where police found her missing belongings arranged in a circle of black soot. The high desert of Shiprock, New Mexico, is a landscape of jagged sandstone and heavy silence. Here, the wind moves through the dry brush with a hollow, scratching sound. It whistles through the metal vents of the swamp cooler on the roof of the small beige Navajo Housing Authority home. For Paloma, this house was supposed to be a sanctuary. Because they lived so far out, she and her girlfriend Dolly relied on the outside world coming to them. They ordered everything online. Brown boxes with the smiling arrow logo arrived almost daily. Clothes, gadgets, household supplies. Their delivery driver, a man named Diego, was a fixture of this routine. He drove the white van up their long dirt driveway 3 or 4 times a week. He knew their schedule. He knew their dog. He knew exactly which door they used. In the desert, safety is an illusion maintained by the convenience of modern delivery, but the desert is always there, watching. At 9:14 p.m., the routine shattered. Paloma picked up the trash bag, heavy with the cardboard remnants of the week's deliveries. She stepped onto the porch. The door clicked shut behind her. She dragged the bin toward the road. The plastic wheels rumbled against the dry, packed dirt. Then she stopped. There was no scream. There was no struggle. There was only the sudden, sharp sting of something small and hard hitting her neck. The effect was instant. In a heartbeat, Paloma's voice died in her throat. Her muscles turned to heavy stone. She stood frozen, her mind screaming for her legs to move, but her body refused to answer. From the shadows of the hogback ridges, a figure emerged. He stepped into the pale light of the porch. It was Diego, the delivery driver. But tonight there was no scanner. There was no van. He didn't run toward her. He flowed. He moved with a terrifying liquid grace that looked wrong on a human frame. He didn't say a word. He simply placed a hand on her shoulder, and she, unable to resist, turned and walked with him into the dark. The next 3 days were not a blur for Paloma. They were a crystal-clear nightmare. She wasn't unconscious. The toxin he had used kept her body limp, but her mind was wide awake. She remembered the cold, damp floor of the cave high in the cliffs. She remembered the smell of old copper and burnt sage. Diego did not act like a kidnapper. He didn't ask for ransom. He didn't interrogate her. He treated her like an object he was preparing for a ceremony. He stripped her of her outer layers and began the marking. He took cold charcoal and black ash from a small fire and drew symbols on her skin. He drew them on her forehead, her chest, and the palms of her hands. They were inverted shapes, jagged and wrong, meant to reverse her natural protection. Then came the hair. He produced a small, rusted knife. With careful, almost reverent movements, he cut small locks of hair from the base of her neck. He didn't discard them. He placed them into a small leather pouch. Paloma watched, helpless, knowing the lore. If they have your hair, they own you. They can twist your health and your mind from miles away. But the worst torture was the silence. He would sit inches from her face, his legs folded beneath him. He wouldn't blink. He would just stare into her eyes for hours, his chest rising and falling in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. He was feeding. He was breathing in her terror, drinking the fear radiating off her paralyzed body like heat from a fire. When he finally spoke, it broke her. He leaned close to her ear, his breath smelling of raw meat. But the voice that came out of his throat wasn't his. It was Dolly's. "You're never leaving," he whispered in Dolly's exact pitch and cadence. "I'm so tired of you, Paloma. I'm glad you're gone." He mimicked Dolly perfectly, saying cruel, hateful things, twisting their private jokes into weapons. He was trying to shatter her mind, to replace her memories of love with his own poison. On the 3rd day, the paralysis began to fade. The driver had left the cave, perhaps to hunt, perhaps to mock the search parties. Paloma's fingers twitched, then her toes. The heavy fog lifted just enough for adrenaline to take over. She didn't think. She moved. She scrambled out of the cave, her body shaking violently, and threw herself down the steep shale of the cliffside. She ran until her lungs burned. She ran until she hit Highway 491 and flagged down a patrol car. When the police brought her back to the station, she was a wreck of soot and tremors, but she insisted they go back. "I know where he took me," she whispered. "I know what he is." 2 local officers drove Paloma and Dolly to the base of the cliffs. They hiked up to the V-notch in the rock. The officers stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. "Police!" one shouted, but the cave was empty of life. In the center of the floor, however, lay something that made the officers stop dead. It was a coyote hide, but it wasn't a rug. It was mangled, hollowed out, and damp. It held the disturbing shape of a human body, as if something had just unzipped it and stepped out of it like a discarded suit of clothes. Surrounding the skin was a perfect circle of black soot. Inside that circle, arranged with a precision that defied logic, were Paloma's missing belongings. The hair tie he had cut, a glove, her keychain. "This is..." One officer started, then trailed off. He shone his light on the wall. There were smudge marks where Paloma had described the man leaning. "We checked the courier service," the other officer said, his voice tight. "We called the company you use. They don't have a driver named Diego. They don't have anyone who fits that description on this route." Paloma looked at the skin on the floor. The delivery van, the schedule, the trust. It was all a performance. They went home, but the sanctuary was gone. The house felt like a trap. That night, Dolly stood by the kitchen window, staring out into the dark. The police had said to lock the doors, but locks don't work on things that can change their shape. In the distance, near the edge of their yard, she saw movement. A lone coyote stood perfectly still. It wasn't hunting. It wasn't sniffing the ground. Its fur was matted and dark. As Dolly watched, the creature did the impossible. It rose. It stood up on its hind legs, balancing perfectly, upright like a man. It had the same posture as the driver who used to carry boxes to their door. It turned its head and looked directly at the window. It didn't run. It just stood there, its yellow eyes locked onto them, waiting for the next time the trash needed to be taken out. He had her hair. He knew her fear. And now, he was just waiting to finish the delivery.